Hello friends, thank you for joining me. So this is going to be my May wrap up for 2023. I read a lot of green colored books today. So that is why I'm very greened up today. Very earthy, very springy. It is the very start of June, so once again I am on time, and hopefully I will get this edited sooner rather than later so that it will be timely. So let's go ahead and get into all the books that I read in May. The first thing that I finished was just such a delightful read, just a great way to kick off the month, and it was Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater. This is a historical fantasy that takes place in the Regency era of England, which is like the early 1800s, and you're following this young woman named Dora Eddings, who is missing half of her soul because it was stolen by a fairy as a child. And because of this, she lacks the ability to feel emotions very strongly, and it makes her kind of a black sheep in polite society. And in the process of helping her cousin find a husband, she meets a man named Elias, who is England's magician. He's a very grumpy person, but he agrees to help Dora try and make her soul whole again. And this has romance and mystery and charming writing and characters, and I loved it. I gave it 5 stars. I filmed a separate review of this book, which I will link if you want to hear my more in-depth thoughts, but I love historical fantasy just in this vein, with strong female leads who don't fit the mold of society. I love 1800s England as a setting. I love the kind of fae that are in this story, which is the more insidious and whimsical kind, and the characters are very funny and charming. I just really enjoyed this, and I bought the other 2 books in the series. From what I can tell, they have some recurring characters, but both of the other books follow different main characters and have different storylines. And the 3rd book features a queer romance as well, so that's great. But yes, this book was excellent, 5 out of 5 stars. So I completed a trilogy. I listened to the audiobook for Holy Sister by Mark Lawrence, narrated by Heather O'Neill, which is the last book in the Book of the Ancestor series. And this is an adult fantasy series following a girl named Nona Gray as she grows up in the convent of Sweet Mercy, which teaches girls to be deadly killers. And it takes place on this icy planet called Abeth, where there's only like a small slice of the planet, like a ring around the circumference, that is actually habitable, and the rest is covered in ice. And there's magic, there's political intrigue, and there's cool battles. And theoretically, I should have really liked this, but unfortunately I only gave this 3 out of 5 stars, which isn't like bad. The first book I gave 4 stars and I really enjoyed it, but the last 2 books, books 2 and 3, were just kind of meh. And the last couple hours of the audiobook were very intense and very good, but for most of the rest of the book, I was just kind of like anxious for it to be over. It felt disjointed, and I was kind of disillusioned with some of the characters, including Nona. So it was just kind of a bummer that I didn't love the series. And there is another series set in the same world, but I don't plan on picking that up. I don't know, I'm not sure that I love Mark Lawrence's storytelling style on the whole. So the series was fine. I didn't love the 3rd book and didn't love the series as a whole. Then I finished The Buried and the Bound by Rochelle Hassan, and this is the Owl Crate edition, and this is a contemporary fantasy following 3 teenagers. There's Aziza, who is a hedge witch, Leo, who was cursed to forget his true love, and Tristan, who made a deal with this creature called the Hag and is forced to serve her. And they all have their own motivations and are eventually brought together to defeat this evil entity in the woods. And I'd give this a 4.5 out of 5, but I've decided to round down to 4. I had a good time reading this, and this is quite the monster menagerie. There are so many different fae creatures and cryptids, so if you like magical creatures, then I'd highly recommend this. There's lots of magic, lots of action. I was more drawn into the setting and the action than the characters themselves, but they were still good characters. I think that Tristan got annoying to me. There was a lot of pining going on, which I don't really care for. And the parental figures were also kind of infuriating in this. But there is a queer romance, sort of. Kind of hard to explain without spoiling it, but I thought that it was very enjoyable, and it was just fun. It was a fun book, one of the better Owl Crate books I've read, and it's the first in what I think is going to be a duology, and there are a lot of things that were not wrapped up by the end, and I would consider reading the second book after it comes out, but it's not going to be high on my priority list. Then I finished the audiobook for Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant and narrated by Christine Lacken. And this is an adult horror thriller about killer mermaids in the simplest terms, and you mainly follow this scientist named Tori, whose sister was on this ship that sailed to the Marianas Trench, and her sister, along with the entire crew, were killed supposedly by mermaids. And this company asks Tori and a whole bunch of other scientists to come with them on a new expedition to find out the truth of what happened and to prove the existence of mermaids. This was a 4.5 out of 5. I did decide to round down to 4. These mermaids were scary and freaky. Loved it. If you liked all of the science-y explanations in like Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, and if you like monster horror, creature horror, then you might really like this book. It was a very slow burn, very character driven, with a lot of marine biology information and sciencey stuff. This approaches mermaids as if they were real, and it takes into account, what their biology might be like, how they might communicate, and things like that. There is a queer romance. One of the characters is neurodivergent, and there are a pair of deaf twins who use sign language to communicate, so there's some really good representation in this book. The ending was a little abrupt, but overall this was really compelling to me. I enjoyed the mundane parts and the scary parts, and normally I'm more of an action girly. I prefer there to be more action, and I don't like books that are really slow normally, but this was just a really interesting and a fun time. I read the book Feed by Mira Grant last October and really didn't like it. I can see echoes of that in this book, but I just enjoyed this so much more. So I'm happy about that. She has been redeemed. 4.5, 4 out of 5 stars. It was really good. Then I read Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. This is a fantasy about a girl named Tress who goes off on this adventure to rescue the man she loves. And she has to sail this ocean that is made up of these spores that come to the planet's surface from its moons, and the spores kind of seethe and let ships float through them, but the spores are very volatile and dangerous when they get wet, so it's very treacherous, and she has to find a way to rescue Charlie, the man that she loves, from this powerful sorceress. And I think that I'm giving this a 4.5 out of 5 also, but rounding up to 5, and this was a fun time, and the idea for this book was born from the question of, what if Princess Buttercup from The Princess Bride decided to go search for Wesley after he disappeared? So that gives you a good idea of the vibe and the tone of this, and it's narrated by a character named Hoyd, who is part of Brandon Sanderson's larger Cosmere universe, and he's really funny and witty, and the narration, he just really elevates this book to how good it is, in my opinion. But it's a really charming adventure. Tress is very innocent and kind and wins over everyone that she meets, and the setting is really cool. It's Brandon Sanderson, of course it is, and you get to see how these spores can potentially be harnessed and manipulated. Very typical of Sanderson again. This book has a lot of references to other Cosmere things. You don't have to have read his other series like Mistborn or Stormlight to enjoy the story. It's a standalone, but I think that the more knowledge you have about the Cosmere, the more you can appreciate all of the references that Hoyd makes. So this was really funny and just a solid fantasy adventure that you can read as a standalone, but I especially in particular recommend it for people who have read other books in Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere universe. And then I finished Revelle by Lyssa Mia Smith, and I got this through Owlcrate, and this is a YA historical fantasy that takes place on this fictional island called Charmant off the coast of New York in the 1920s. And there are these magical families on this island who live sort of in their own little world on this island, their own kind of ecosystem, and you're following this girl named Lux Revelle, who is part of this family of entertainers, the Revelles, and she does trapeze. And her family can manipulate people's emotions by using precious gemstones like diamonds, emeralds, stuff like that as fuel. And this takes place during the Prohibition era, and Lux has to find a way to keep her family's business going, and their success is apparently very dependent on there being booze. And it's during Prohibition, so there's this whole fake dating situation between her and this guy who is from a family of time travelers, and he wants to run for mayor of the island, and he's the only bootlegger in town. But this mainlander named Jameson comes to the island, and something sparked between him and Lux, and there's danger lurking, and Lux has to make sacrifices to save her family. And I had a fun time with this also. I would give it like a very solid 3.5. I did decide to round down to 3. I have a hard time with time travel books because of the paradoxes you have to ignore to make it work. And there's a lot of pining happening coming from Jameson, which I don't care much for. The magic system was fun, though I just had some questions about it and how it works, but there were some intense scenes and drama. The main character, Lux, ended up manipulating people like all book long, and it felt kind of icky to me, even though we're supposed to root for her. I still enjoyed this, and I would recommend it if you enjoy YA historical fantasy with a pining romance, but I had some issues with it, and it felt a little long, but yeah. 3 out of 5 stars. And the last thing I finished this month, I ended on a high note. I read volume 4 of Heartstopper, which is the most current volume in the series that is out now. Volume 5 is coming this fall, and I'm so excited. This series follows 2 British teenage boys who fall in love, and it's the cutest, most wholesome thing I've ever read. I adore this series, and this was another 5-star. This volume focuses very heavily on mental health, and one of the characters, Charlie, has an eating disorder, and it's handled with understanding and care. It made me cry, just like the last 2 volumes did. It was great. I mean, I have nothing more to say. It's great. I just highly recommend the series as a whole. And those are all the things that I read in May. Generally a pretty good reading month. There was nothing really bad, a couple things that were mediocre and a few that were really great. Had some 5-star reads. And yeah, so thank you very much for watching. And again, hopefully I'm gonna get this up in time. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys in my next one. Bye.